Arc 6, The Corridor of Memories. Chapter 14, Faith Built Atop the Sand. The warmth coming off from Ram's palm contrasted with the scorn of the cold sand. Both of those were the realities which Natsuki Subaru was faced with now, that was the present that he should accept. Subaru, Ram. Ram, what? Subaru, your fingers sure do feel nice and smooth, it's his beauty. Ram, this Barusa sure pushes his luck, doesn't he? Subaru, will you ever stop using people's nicknames as curses? Subaru voiced out his complaints with tears in his eyes after having had his cheek slapped in recompense for his careless remark. However, Ram, who held a lantern in her hand, did not reply to him. Instead, she hurriedly moved off, keeping her distance away from him. It was something cold from her, even though up until now, she had shown him a kindness which was seldom seen. Though, if things stayed like this, since Subaru would be unable to even have an awkward conversation about it. Part of his true intention had been to go back to how they usually interacted. Subaru, right here, we're. Ram, it's pitch black absolutely everywhere. You remember the crevices opening up in the sand sea, and our dragon carriages being swallowed up by them, I presume? I don't want to have to explain more than that. Subaru, no, I'm fine with hearing just that. I get it. Ram, okay. Subaru received an outline of the current situation from Ram as he took a deep breath. He understood that he had returned by death and that his returned by death point had been changed already. Subaru had met death 3 times in these sand dunes with this. Twice he had been killed above ground by the flashes of light, which had likely been fired from the watchtower. However, this third time was far different to the other 2. He had died from being attacked by a monster at the underground. He could barely keep his body from shaking as he recalled the manner of his death that he'd experienced just a minute ago. Subaru, I never thought I'd die like that. The manner in which Subaru had died now was what you would call a fiery death. His whole body had been scorched by crimson flames, and he had been burnt to death still without understanding everything that was going on. It was hard to forget that his whole body had been licked by red-hot tongues, and that every part of him had melted rather than burnt. He knew from knowledge that the human body was a lump of fat. However, was it really something that melted away so easily and runnily like that? That his burnt remains were tragic, was something which he would indeed agree with. Ram, Barusu, have you calmed down yet? If you've settled down, we need to talk. Subaru, Yeah, I'm okay, is it just me and you here? Ram, if that was the case, Barusu, I would be ditching you and running away for my own safety. Since I haven't, well, you understand what that means, don't you? Subaru, did you just show a part 2 to the kindness you seldom show? Ram, you sure do say a lot of disrespectful things towards the bundle of love and compassion which is me, don't you? She came back whilst you were spouting out nonsense. Looking to his left at the lantern, and then looking at where it was pointing from Ram's right, he saw the glow of a lamplight approaching from deeper within the cave. The lantern was swaying back and forth at around head height, and just as he expected, the source of light was held by Anastasia, who was writing Patrash. Anastasia, Ramsan, Natsuki-kun, seems your conversation's finished, right? Subaru, Anastasia, Patrash, is that you? Anastasia, who was writing on Patrash, spoke out the same greeting as she had before as she flashed him a grim. And, to those words, Ram pinched the hem of her skirt like before and bowed. Ram, thank you for your thoughtfulness, Anastasia-sama. May I ask, what do the surroundings look like? Anastasia, I just went to look a little further inside, but I couldn't find any of the other young'uns. It's just the 3 of us who were hurled down around here. And this young'un looking one. Ram, I see. Anastasia, you gotta keep your chin up, though mayhaps that in itself ain't gonna be of any use to us. Ram, thank you for your concern. Indeed, I understand. I'll make sure to do so. Anastasia voiced her apprehensions from Dragonback. To which Ram replied in the likeness of how she would usually speak, different to how she spoke to Subaru. Anastasia's face was clearly visible this time since Ram was the one holding the lantern. Everything Anastasia had said was exactly the same as last time. She had come to tell them the reality of the situation, namely that the others were lost and scattered about with REM. Subaru, so for now, the only ones that were able to join up is just us 4? Pretty damn awful that we have no fighting strength. Anastasia, we ain't as scattered as we thought, Ed Natsuki-kun? What special good luck charm did you even get Ramsan to cast us? Ram, unfortunately, nothing would happen even if it has to decide between just me and Barusu. Only Barusu would end up dead when he would be found the next day. Subaru, what do you mean? Do you mean like the werewolf in a game of werewolf? Scary. Their comments were not meant as a show of bravado, but rather, Anastasia and Ram exchanged words in such a way as to calm Subaru, who had just woken up. Though his grasp of the situation was quick since it was the second time around, they were still in a place where it paid dividends and getting a move on immediately, even now. Subaru, Ram, just to make sure, you don't know where REM is using your synesthesia, right? Ram, that's correct, it's no use. Since I feel the link, I have no doubt that at least she's alive. But, I don't know any more than that. All we can do is pray that she's not alone. Subaru, given that my everyday deeds are tied to fortune and misfortune, Rem's deeds will just be good ones, make no mistake in that. I absolutely believe in her safety. If this theory was right, it was entirely because of his own deeds that he was going through an absurd amount of suffering and death. He wanted to go and close his eyes to that. Subaru on top of that. Subaru absolutely couldn't let Ram and Anastasia know, that was his greatest anxiety. It seemed like everyone he wanted to save had been scattered away from him thanks to his return by death point having been updated. It was just like when he couldn't use his return by death to get Rem's name back. What if tragedy had struck his companions due to his return by death updating now? Subaru, I absolutely won't allow that. For those who weren't here. Emilia, Beatrice, Julius, Maylie. And REM. He prayed that nothing disastrous had happened to them. Natsuki Subaru prayed that they weren't hurt, even if they weren't in his reach. Ram, Barusu. Aren't you connected with Beatrice-sama? Subaru, I've tried, but it's no good. As long as there's a path between us, Biko herself should be able to sense me. But even if I try to call her, the connection is pretty weak. Anastasia, might be due to the miasma. Even spirits can't keep their breath held long, even my echidna's grumbling every so often. It was just Emilia-san who was fine taught. Subaru, I guess it was the same for you as well, at Biko? Beatrice, stout-hearted as she was, probably wouldn't let out any complaints even if she was in a bad state. Were that to happen, Subaru would have absolutely noticed it. Beatrice being in a bad state would influence everyone else's safety as well. When they safely reunited, he'd have to tell her off. Subaru, that's why, for that too, we need to rejoin with the other guys. Let's go deeper into the cave. It was likely that they'd come across the monster which had burned him once again if they went towards its depths. But, even so, there was no other way but to go forward. So to reunite with his precious companions as well, there was no other way but to go forward. Anastasia, you're the only one walking Natsuki-kun, ain't your futon getting worse? Subaru, I'm fine. Do take care though since Patrash won't welcome anyone with open arms except me. Every time, it seems like she's about to bite off one of Biko's drill curls. Anastasia, ha, what a great joke. Patrash-chan is a good girl, she wouldn't do that. Ain't that right? Patrash. Patrash gave a quick grunt at Subaru, who was leading them with his lantern whilst they made their way deeper into the cave. Her grunt was the sort she made when she had no complaints. Patrash was still a hard worker, even in spite of her carrying other people who weren't Subaru, since she knew it was an emergency. As expected, she was a woman worthy of being part of the Emilia camp. Having placed Ram and Anastasia on Patrash, Subaru was the only who traversed the maze of sand on foot. They followed the same way as last time, with the four of them moving forward towards the depths of the cave. They may have left dozens of minutes earlier than last time, but since he didn't know when that monster would appear down here, it'd all be down to nothing more than a margin of error. Subaru, its lair is way over there, maybe it's its feeding ground, or its playground. What couldn't be called feed was the sheer amount of burnt corpses which had littered that area. The charred corpse which Subaru had accidentally grabbed had probably been an animal's. From its shape it seemed like he'd grabbed the hind leg of a four-legged creature, but there weren't any indications that it had been eaten. The amount of charred corpses over there had been countless. He could even have appreciated its cuisine as being simply gourmet witch beast if it was using fire to just prepare its meal. However, it merely burnt its prey and left their corpses behind untouched. That monster possessed a cruel nature that delighted itself in burning its prey to death. It made sense that it had a way to capture it and a place to burn it. It was a grotesque figure, munitioned with abnormal amounts of heat. Subaru also feared the witch beast itself, which existed with a wrong form as a living creature, at the same time as he recalled the moment he had burned to death. Anastasia, from what I can see, we should still be in the sand dunes around here, but maybe underneath it. What do you think, Natsuki-kun? Subaru. Anastasia, Natsuki-kun? Subaru? Ah, that's right. I think so too. Ram, did you actually hear what she said? You're being rude if you think that response adequate. Ram swiftly exposed Subaru's mindless agreement. However, Subaru hastily shook his hands and head in denial. Subaru, no way, I heard everything properly. And what's more is that I'm sticking with my stance of absolute agreement. Ram, really, when you take off your bra when you go to bed, your breasts don't sag an inch, is that what you're saying? You're affirming it? Disgusting. Subaru, isn't the way you're bringing that up to me disgusting? Or rather, it's not like what she's saying, don't you agree with me? Subaru, in a state of disbelief, turned towards Anastasia for help. She gave him a wry smile, and then spoke out saying, "You shouldn't worry. Anastasia, Ramsan was messin' about just now. I don't think it's proper to speak like this in this terrible situation." Subaru, why ya? Yeah, that's right. I was in a hurry. And in the first place, neither Ram or Anastasia's breasts would sag, nor do they have enough to even notice. Anastasia, whoopsie, sorry Natsuki-kun. My hand slipped. Subaru, why the past tense, and why so hot? Her lantern was pressed to the nape of his neck, and the heat coming off from its magical or burnt his neck. With the sensation of his fiery death resuscitated within him, he shuddered and rolled down onto the cold sand, shouting and screaming as he relieved himself from the pain. And as he did so, still collapsed with the back of his body lying on top of the sand, he glared at the two of them on Dragonback. Subaru, isn't that cruel doing that all of a sudden? I would have liked at least a chance to explain. Anastasia, you can't go criticizing people's physical characteristics and then showing contempt for 'em. You absolutely can't do that unless you're masochistic. If this was Kararaji, you'd lose all your reputation and become broke. Don't you agree, Ramsan? Ram, I don't mind. Besides, Rems are bigger, so we keep the balance between us. It's no issue for me. If he went and spoke out on their beautiful sisterly love which complemented each other, he'd once again provoke their ire. Thus, he kept quiet. Subaru grimaced, his nape tingled in slight pain. He stood up and coughed, brushing away sand. Subaru, anyways, let's get down to business. We're underground here, that's what you said, right? Anastasia, what, why actually heard me? That's right, I think so. The reason why is 'cause the air is heavier than above ground, and the temperature is lower. Don't you agree? Ram, underneath the sand dunes. We'll have to pray that this isn't a sandworm's burrow. Subaru, it could also be worse than that. Anastasia pulled her robe in tighter, appealing to the chill, a gesture which Ram followed suit in. Subaru subtly weaved in the reality of the situation, while he agreed with their opinions. Of course, even if there were sandworms here, it would be a Herculean task to beat them back with the meager fighting strength they had available amongst them. Even so, sandworms were still better as they somewhat had a strategy to deal with them. That witch beast, which for now he'd call a centaur for convenience, was something which Subaru had no idea of how to deal with in battle. He had come across it and been immediately burnt on the spot. He was sure he'd meet the same manner of death, if he bumped into it like last time. Subaru, practically, it's likely we'll come across witch beasts other than the sandworms. Even though they're witch beasts which roam these sand dunes, I think it's a good idea if we came up with a plan for them for later. Ram, yes. Nonetheless, I can only say that I just know what I heard Meili speaking about on the way here. And other than that, perhaps how a typical witch beast lives. Anastasia, the witch beasts of the Ogria sand dunes are far more aggressive due to the effects of the miasma, and there are also witch beasts that shouldn't be living here in the first place. Even so, knowing is better than not knowing. When Subaru put out his suggestion, Ram and Anastasia both nodded in agreement. As a result, they talked about the witch beasts whilst they continued their search forward into the depths of the cave. Ram, sandworms stand out due to their stench and ugliness, but in contrast to their aggressive nature, their bodies aren't that strong. Even if their bodies are large, my magic can kill them easily. If anything, your whip may actually be useful, Barusu. Subaru, seriously? My whip would damage them? Anastasia, it said they tend to be cowardly, and if they feel pain it'd seem like they'd back away. It'd depend on the type of pain they'd feel, but at least the chance ain't zero, wouldn't you think? Ram, I don't want to come across a Banassi, if possible. Subaru, is that a vicious witch beast despite it having the name of a rodent? Anastasia, nah, it ain't got any fighting strength. But it fights dirty. It puffs itself up until its body goes kapow, blowing up anyone near it. And with that, its blood and guts will shower its enemy. Subaru, then, is its blood poisonous or something? Ram, it's not like that. It's just pestering, but once one of them does that and their stench pours out, other Banassi flock over and do the same thing. You end up becoming smeared in blood. Subaru, scary. As expected, there were a lot of witch beasts which were unfamiliar to him, and there were many things which made him want to frown when listening to their composition. After they finished their discussion on those witch beasts, Subaru felt like the time had come and chose the topic. Subaru, so, the next one is about a witch beast I saw in the distance back at the sand dunes. Do you know about a witch beast which has a human body attached to the body of a horse that spouts flames from its back? Ram and Anastasia. Subaru told them about the centaur, keeping in tune with the discussion which they'd had so far regarding the mode of life of witch beasts. It was a distinct witch beast. Even if this witch beast was one of the more aggressive varieties which were native to these sand dunes, if there was an origin to it, he should be able to make a breakthrough on it. It'd be ideal if there were weak points to it which were easy to understand, such as being weak to water due to its fire. Anastasia, sorry, but I ain't got a clue. What about ya, Ram-san? Ram, I'm sorry as well, but this witch beast invites only revulsion even in just listening to this. Subaru, you both don't know, huh? However, he only got those answers from both of them. It seemed that neither of them had any knowledge of the centaur, or a different kind of them with those abnormal characteristics. But that was the witch beast they'd likely first come across. He didn't want to give up on finding a breakthrough with only the answers he'd received now. Subaru, you really don't know? Like, part of Patrash's head becoming a human body, and 2 arms sticking out from there. And a mouth stretching vertically across part of its body. And finally, a horn growing from its neck of its human body instead of a head. Anastasia, Iya. What the hell? That's so gross. Ram, honestly, that's so off-putting. The more details he put into his explanation, the more he put off the women. Seeing even Patrash's face looking disgusted after she received Subaru's semblance of an explanation, Subaru dropped his shoulders in defeat. It genuinely seemed like they all had no clue about it. Ram, if you happened to catch a glimpse of a witch beast like that in the first place, you needed to report it back then. Why did you let such a seemingly dangerous witch beast go by? Subaru, no, that's not. It's because it was nighttime. Maybe it was because Meili's divine protection was active, so I just saw it in the distance not approaching us from all the way over there. It was like when you were being treated by Amelia-tan inside of the dragon carriage. Ram, disgusting. Subaru, so that's all you're gonna be saying? Subaru was discouraged by the lack of a response as he fumbled around for a suitable excuse. With it ending up like this, they had no means capable of striking first against the centaur. All he could do was search for a plan to avoid meeting the real thing whilst he spelled out its danger in anticipation. Subaru, for now I'll call it a centaur, but I reckon it's a really dangerous thing. A mane grew from the back of its human body, and it was burning like fire. It had quite a tenacious look to it. I don't know how since it didn't have a face, but that's the feeling it gave off, so it's likely that if we don't take care, it'll come and chase us. Ram, then why did you ignore it? Do you have a death wish? Subaru, I think there were misleading words in the explanation right now as well. He couldn't deny that his explanation had become fairly absurd in wanting to let them know of the danger. However, by telling them this as a precaution, the girls would likely be able to keep themselves on guard for danger in regards to an encounter with an actual centaur. That's all he had managed. He hadn't managed to tell them about when he had really met the centaur, and they had no countermeasures against it. Subaru thought about a more fundamental approach as well. That was Anastasia, Natsuki-kun, Ram-san. Can you stop the chatter for just a ammo? Anastasia said that, and motioned for Patrash to stop. The clever Earth Dragon had stopped before she had been told to, but she drooped her head as if she understood what Anastasia meant. And then, Anastasia held out her lantern in front of her and said, Anastasia, there's a fork in the road. Before his eyes was the first part of his plan to avoid meeting the centaur. As before, a dread hung in the air at the fork, enough to make one grimace. And that dread came clearly flowing in from the right path. Anastasia, left or right, which way do you want to go? Subaru, if we follow Kurapika's theory, going to the right is the correct option. Anastasia, who's that? As before, Subaru's knowledge was nothing but foreign in this other world. Subaru had already experienced it with his body, so his words weren't unsubstantiated. Subaru, in times like these, people tend to unconsciously want to pick the left side. Though various factors are at play like one's dominant hand or eye, ethology has shown actual evidence of that, especially when there are no additional conditions attached. Ram, ethology. What a smart word came out of your mouth. However, are you ignoring this horrible presentiment which you can feel coming from the right path? Isn't this a condition? Whether it would be correct or not to take the right path this time, they had to take it. Having deemed so, Subaru would have to try and persuade the others with logic, however he felt a strong feeling of aversion to the horrible sensation that was drifting in from the right path. If they could, both Ram and Anastasia didn't want to take the right path, he could see that from the look in their eyes. Persuading them and making them take the right path was what Subaru had to do. He wouldn't let them go towards their death so easily after getting the chance from returning by death. Subaru, it's true that a blatantly horrible atmosphere is coming from the right. But I think it's just a little too blatant. It's as if it's saying, don't come here, right? Ram. Subaru, it's exactly like the mechanism which breaks through that sandtime and the flower garden of witch beasts before the watchtower. They're far too intricate to be something that cropped up naturally. Didn't you think so? Anastasia, in other words, Natsuki-kun, you want to say that the sandtime, the flower garden and this cave as well are things of artifice? In contrast to Ram who had sunk into silence, Anastasia followed what Subaru had been trying to say. Subaru cracked his fingers at hearing her response and voiced his agreement with that's right. Subaru, they've set a bunch of traps since they want to keep us away. Why haven't we come across a single witch beast here in nearly an hour if this wasn't something artificial? We all seem to agree that this is part of the Augria sand dunes. And though Meili's not here, we haven't encountered any witch beast lairs. That's unnatural. Ram, so, here we're in a place where someone's hand. No, where the sage's hand came into play. Subaru, with that, we know that the sage's personality isn't very pleasant. Ram. Although it was an opinion which was half-coated in truth, Subaru admired that even if he spoke himself, it didn't mean that he hadn't been able to sound persuasive. In fact, when he looked back on the journey through the Augria sand dunes up until now, there had been many things said which could certainly be called traps that were there to impede their journey towards the watchtower. It could even be called a trial. And it was a fact as well that they hadn't come across any witch beasts yet in this cave. Of course, Subaru's thoughts were incorrect in the end, as he knew that they would come across the centaur at the end. However, no, perhaps that centaur was the last guard. There was a chance that its presence was a mechanism that denoted a last show of strength to those who came to enter the watchtower. In that case, he just had no way to express the malice in their choice of guardian. However, Ram, there's certainly logic even in Barusu's point. Subaru, Seriously? Anastasia, why are you acting so surprised? Is it strange? Subaru instinctively reacted with surprise at Ram's words, who had sunk into pensive silence. And after that, Anastasia, who had seen that response, gave a wry smile and lifted up the pom-poms on her hat with both of her hands. Anastasia, to tell you the truth, I really don't want to go to the right. But now that you said that our opinions have been induced to form up and pick the left, I don't want to go with it anymore. Subaru, that's an opinion that doesn't seem like you, who lived by your do-or-die intuition. You sure have been swept away. Anastasia, are you just saying even I'll do it if your opinion becomes approved? The wry smile on her face grew deeper, which as a matter of fact, probably indicated that Iridna was unable to imitate the vital point that had been Anastasia's do-or-die intuition. This was a last resort for her too. She should have had a difficult time deciding whether or not to get on board with Subaru's point. Subaru, so, what about you, Ram? Ram, it's as I said. I can understand Barusu's point too, considering how things went in the sand dunes up until here. We can just agree that apart from the sage's wicked disposition, there's also the harsh environments that those who can't reach the watchtower are subject to one after the other. That's why it's obvious that someone has meddled. Subaru, I sure don't agree with calling them natural things. Ram, so, although I don't fully agree with your point, Barusu, it doesn't mean that I don't agree with some parts of it. With that said, there's no hesitation in checking the right path. Subaru, what do you mean? Anastasia, it's annoying for her to do what Natsuki-kun says, but she's going to go along with it, is what she's saying. Anastasia politely interpreted what Ram had meant to say. In fact, it seemed like it was the correct interpretation considering that Ram didn't correct any of it. In short, it meant that both Ram and Anastasia had accepted Subaru's cajolery. Subaru, all right. Excellent, muchas gracias. I won't make either of you regret it. Ram, I will take at least some share of the responsibility in my choice. Don't you go trying to carry my share of the burden on your back as you please. Focus your useless resourcefulness only on REM. Anastasia, if you make me regret it, I'm gonna let you take the responsibility for it. If that happens, we'll have to consult with the abacus for how much it's gonna be, don't you think? Subaru, both of you are so damn scathing. His delight was short-lived, and his speech in which he had taken responsibility for the choice was quickly assailed by the both of them. Although he didn't know how serious Iridna's trace of Anastasia was, Iridna was putting in great efforts so that things wouldn't end up in regret. Only that feeling was genuine. Subaru, plus, it's not like the obstacles end with just their persuasion. Indeed, that was right. In the end, all Subaru had got was the right to make a challenge. The challenge against the real hurdles started from here on out. The fork in the road awaited their decision as it exuded an overwhelming negative atmosphere out. They were going to take the right path where the air lay thick and visible, ever worsening. If this was a trial which the sage had prepared, he wondered what they were thinking by opting to make this path its start. Subaru, if he's waiting for us beyond this point, then let's give him as much of a surprise as possible. I'm gonna slap his face and make him apologize over and over, and after that, I'm gonna make him find Emilia and the others. Determining that, Subaru turned towards the right path and brandished his lantern there, having declared that. And then, Ram gave a soft sigh behind Subaru's back. Ram, I agree with you, but there's still a chance that Emilia-sama, along with everyone else, will make it to the watchtower before us. Subaru, honestly, wasn't this a good spot to show off? Subaru, whose spirit was being strained even before the challenge began, voiced out his disgruntlement. After those exchanges, the three of them and their Earth Dragon, the group of four, went into the right path. He still had a bad feeling, even now. That feeling seemed to make even the sand underneath his feet feel different. Whilst tasting this discomfort, Subaru wiped the cold sweat that trickled down his forehead and grinned at Patrash. Subaru, come to think of it, I was wrong to decide which way to take without hearing your opinion. Patrash. Subaru, huh? Where you're going is the road I will take. And whatever road it is, no matter how harsh, you'll believe in me since I always weather through? Hey, you're way too handsome, I'm falling in love. Ram, he's being nonsensical, but he doesn't seem to be doing it by mistake, so he's being sinful, don't you think? What good do you see in him? Ram muttered that out as if she were shocked when she saw Subaru rambling on about Patrash's feelings, as if he was her, whilst she remained taciturn. Though Patrash would usually immediately rebuff such talk, right now she had remained composed as if he hadn't said anything wrong. Or, she had thought it foolish to waste strength doing that, so she was saving it for until they reached a safer place. One of the two. Likely the latter. Subaru, even if so, can you go easy on me if possible? Patrash. Subaru, was that a voice of denial just now? Despite having chosen silence until now, she abruptly let off an impatient bark of denial at what he'd said. But then, having the mettle to first of all escape safely from here before berating him was quite the good thing. Because that meant Patrash believed that they could get out of here safely. They kept on walking without any change, with Subaru at the head, and Patrash at the back. The lantern's light illuminated the way several meters ahead, making sure to tread carefully, their exploration continued. Their pace, however, had definitely slowed down compared to their way here. It was even slower than when they'd taken the left road before he had returned by death. The reason why was simple. Subaru, my body, is so heavy. It wasn't that his weight had increased, or that an invisible yokai had climbed onto his back. And in practice, it definitely wasn't any sort of issue that affected his actual corporeal self. That both his body was heavy and his feet unmoving was entirely a mental problem. Sure enough, the right path was brimming with a negative sensation that had caused his feet to seize up. He hoped this was one of the sage's detestable trials, and that if they came out of the forked road, they'd find a safe spot awaiting them ahead of these hopes. He didn't hold a single one. But unfortunately, even those hopes were fleeting and quickly turned. Rather, his negative thoughts, which felt like a curse, grew ever stronger. Subaru. Gulping down some saliva, still keeping his silence, Subaru took a step forward so to move his leaden feet from the sand. His feet were frozen in place, he wouldn't move. Even if in his heart, Subaru knew just how weak and fragile he was, he shouldn't have felt like cowering in this passageway of sand, where nothing had happened yet. Indeed, he felt no fear at heart, and even his head felt clear. Just, his limbs didn't try to move in line with that purpose. His flesh and body, only, were acting against his reason, and the course of his soul. His body instinctually rejected it, and tried to stop him from moving forward. It cost Subaru twice as much time, strength and willpower to move forward. And even he couldn't help but feel tired. Subaru, fool. Can I really whine this much? Violently shaking his head, Subaru tried to forget the feeling of tiredness that laden his body. Choosing the right path had been no one but Subaru's decision. Even though it had been, he couldn't permit himself to try and whine, or such, before the two behind him did. Subaru, well, this walk sure may be a little difficult, but it's no big deal. Surprisingly, our goal may be getting closer. Ram, Barusu. Subaru, oh, what's up? Ram, shut up. Subaru, oh. His attempt at trying to drive away his whining with a show of bravado was shot down by Ram's curt toxicity. Their pace had fallen drastically, and their fear of the surroundings had also only increased. It seemed like probably even Ram was being taxed mentally. That her words were more toxic and curter than usual was proof of that. Subaru, I get what you're feeling, but I think I suck at walking in silence. Ram, are you walking to enjoy yourself? Remember why we're doing this. Subaru, well, no, but like. Ram, be silent and walk. An unapproachable, obstinate attitude. Of course, though Ram's opinion was correct, Subaru had a point as well. Right now, the weight of his body was pulling into sync with the weight on his mind. In other words, it had become a vicious circle where the heavier his mood got, the heavier his body became. He'd wanted to take their minds off it a bit so that things wouldn't end up like that. Keeping on guard was important, as well as wanting to show some consideration, but he wanted them to show that they'd understood that and taken it on board. Or rather, Ram especially should take it on board. She always showed consideration. Still, she might be really struggling. Subaru, do you reckon we should move faster? Ram. Subaru, Ram? Subaru called out, trying to determine how urgent the conditions had got, but Ram didn't bother to reply to his words at all. The light from the two lanterns, one of which was illuminating the path ahead of Subaru, and the other which was illuminating their surroundings from Patrash's neck, didn't allow the particulars of Ram's expression to be seen. With her hood pulled over her head, Ram cast her eyes down to look at Anastasia's back. Her face wasn't visible. Subaru, Ram? Anastasia, not Suki-kun, is that quite enough? Subaru, ah? Stopping in his tracks, Subaru turned his head around to try and look at her expression. But Ram, stubborn as she was, didn't let him see her face, and on top of that Anastasia had defended her. Seeing Subaru's lips bend in frustration, Anastasia scratched her cheek, with a troubled expression adorning her face. Anastasia, I hadn't mentioned it, but Ramsan was considerably flustered after she woke up in the underground. Her composure seemed to have come back because of how plucky she is, but I guess it still looks like she hasn't fully regained it. Subaru, TCH. You're saying too much. Anastasia, look, will you leave this to me? While Anastasia had put some consideration to Ram's feelings, her words lacked in it. Having just had her hidden innermost thoughts divulged, Ram gritting her teeth could be heard all around them, but Anastasia took no notice of it. She raised one of her small hands and pointed it in front of her so that Subaru could see it. Anastasia, we shouldn't talk right now. When your nerves are frayed to the limit, no matter who says what, nothing good will come out of it. ISN that right? Subaru. Anastasia, ISN that right? Though it annoyed him, Anastasia equals Iridna had a point. He had put too much priority in trying to move forward and getting out of the cave safely. Subaru this time definitely hadn't been able to consider Ram's feelings much. The price for doing that had come to bite him back here, and mayhaps had ended up expressed in Ram's attitude. Now that he thought about it, was overly hasty of him to assume that there was a problem there because of Ram. Subaru, you're right. You're definitely right. It was my bad. Ram, reflect on it. Subaru, TCH. Hey, you. Anastasia, stop that, no fightin'. Come on, not Suki-kun, keep moving forward, keep moving forward. Subaru's nerves had become frayed on seeing Ram's attitude, which gave no signs of letting up. However, Anastasia had gotten in between them and somehow stopped him there. She then pointed at Subaru, motioning him to move forward. She nudged the lantern that was fastened around Patrash's neck with her feet, rocking it about. Seeing the silhouettes of the passageway of sand flickering across his sight, Subaru clicked his tongue. Although he couldn't stomach her attitude, there would be no point in them falling into strife here. Fortunately, he could excuse it as the unpleasant atmosphere influencing the highs and lows in their mood. While he could lay the blame on something, there was no need to worsen their relations with such an unnecessary thing. They could talk about their current foul attitudes when they made it safely out from here. Subaru, let's get going. Once again, the search spearheaded by Subaru resumed. However, their pace was still slow and didn't get any faster. In the end, his so-called attempt at picking up their spirits and removing the loads from their body had failed. Since nothing had changed for the better, the chances of the situation improving had naturally become zilch. Even so, when it came to change, there had been some. And it wasn't a change with Subaru and the others, but rather a change with the maze of sand itself. Subaru, no matter how you look at it, the path has become narrower. They had probably spent nearly an hour steadily advancing through the right path. The pathway of sand was narrowing from the left, right, top and bottom. The height and width of the path was reaching a size that would make it impossible for large witch beasts to pass through. There was just enough space for Patrash to squeeze through. However, it was at a size where it wasn't wide enough to accommodate the dragon carriage which Gan pulled. Likely, it was impossible for sandworms and centaurs to pass through too. At least in other words, when it came to the worst situation, i.e. a centaur lying in wait ahead on the path, that situation seemed to have been avoided. Compared to that, no matter what was awaiting ahead, at least they seemed to have avoided going towards the terrible direction. Subaru, but it looks like we'll have to be more cautious since the paths become narrower. We'll probably end up unable to move without any warning. You guys will need to be on your guard too. Ram, TSK. Subaru, hey. Subaru, who had said that thinking about what would happen soon, raised one of his eyebrows at the sudden sound. Turning his head back, he looked at the two on Dragonback who were illuminated by their lantern. No one responded to his shout. However, he knew that Anastasia, who was sitting at the front on top of Patrash, had covered her face with the palm of her hands. That seemed natural for Anastasia, who wanted in one way or another to move forward and keep things rolling along smoothly. Anyway, what Ram had done now was that she had tisked at Subaru's words. Subaru, what have you really been planning from the start? Ram, nothing. Subaru, it ain't nothing. I asked you what have you been planning? Raising his voice at the limit of his patience, Subaru kicked at the wall of sand beside him. Part of the surface of the fragile wall came loose, but Subaru didn't care at all about the sand which sprinkled down on him. All that Subaru saw right now was the insolent Ram. Subaru, all I can hear is you butting in over and over again when people are walking in silence. It seems like this isn't the first time you clicked your tongue at me, isn't that right? Hey, OI, what are you planning? Ram, nothing in particular. I have nothing at all to say to you, Barusu. Subaru, nothing at all, and yet aren't you clicking your tongue at me year after you're going tch? Aren't you doing that? There's got to be a reason for you to be saying that you aren't doing that, even though you are, hasn't there? Subaru's fervor continued to grow stronger than before, in contrast to the cold Ram's attitude. It seemed natural. Everything which Ram had shown was cold and one-sided in contrast to the exertions which Subaru had made up until now. Subaru did not know why he was being looked down upon and rebuked. Subaru, if there's something you want to say, then say it. Go and say it since I'll listen. Ram, that's why I have nothing to say. Subaru, liar. Are you stupid? If you feel like hiding stuff, then hide it all. Now that you've slipped up, flaunt it all off. You say there's nothing? That's a fucking idiot's expression, huh, dumbass. Ram. Ram's mood changed at seeing Subaru hurling insults at her, spittle flying from his mouth. Sat behind Anastasia, she leaned her body out and glared at Subaru. He was unsatisfied with where she sat as well. Hiding behind others, looking down at him from above. Was she planning to rise above them all by borrowing something's strength? Ram, it seems like you've really gotten yourself all worked about moving forward, haven't you, Barusu? Subaru, that's to be expected though, isn't it? What do you think we came here for? We came to meet the sage, didn't we? All the hardships we faced for this, and all the progress we made, what's so funny about it? Ram, you're wrong. We didn't come here to meet the sage. Subaru, Aya? Ram, we came here to return Rem back to how she was. Ram clearly asserted this, all the while glaring at Subaru. Overwhelmed by the sharpness and pressure that emanated from her eyes, Subaru, who had been seething, conviction weakened a little. Saving Rem equals meeting the sage, wasn't it like that? Subaru, it's the same thing, isn't it? Meet the sage and then save Rem. It's connected. Ram, it isn't. Saving Rem comes first, and meeting the sage comes after that. You've got your priorities wrong, yes, you've got them all wrong. Ram's voice trembled as she spoke the last of those words. The fury she had voiced was a wrath that burnt like an unquenchable raging fire that brought together everything the emotionless girl had felt up until now. In the underground area of these cold sand dunes, Ram continued to speak, her words still full to the brim with the fever of wrath. Ram, I came here for Rem, I came here to remember my little sister. And yet, what are we doing now? Rem isn't even here. So stop messing about idly in this place. Subaru, no one's messing about. Because things ended up like this, now that things ended up like this, there's nothing else we can do at the time it did. Am I wrong? Ram, yes, maybe so. But before we make sure of that, Barusu, have you ever worried about Rem even once? Subaru, what? Ram, ever since you woke up below ground, Barusu, have you ever worried about Rem? Or about Emilia-sama? Or about Beatrice-sama? Have you ever at all worried about those who are missing? Ram showered those questions at him, but he kept silent, speaking not a single word in return. Certainly this time around, unlike the last, Subaru hadn't tried to check how everyone else was doing, after he had woken up from returning by death. However, this absolutely wasn't because he wasn't worried about them, but rather because he knew that Ram and Anastasia didn't know anything about them. It was Subaru's consideration. It was care. And despite that, Ram, no, you never did you? You never did, Barusu. You don't care at all about Rem, Barusu, because your head is full of Emilia-sama and Beatrice-sama. Well, so be it, you're just that kind of man. But, I feel bad for Rem. Subaru, shut up. Ram, didn't Rem believe in you, Barusu? Though I don't know, since the two is a convenient story which I've just heard from you, Barusu. Maybe you were just saying whatever popped into your head. You only say what's convenient in front of women. I feel bad for Emilia-sama and Beatrice-sama as well, deceived by such a man. Subaru, shut the hell up. Ram, no, I will not. How many times must I repeat myself? Barusu, you don't care about Rem at all. Even if she isn't found, you would just feel glad. Subaru, don't you mess about with me. His field of view was dyed in crimson, and his nerves had flared up hearing her vent those thoughtless remarks. His anger at the arrogant woman, who had vented out those selfish words whilst looking down upon him from her perch, exploded. He would grab her and drag her down, though the time it would take to do that wasn't quick enough. Subaru, invisible providence. Ram, KAH. Subaru dropped the darkish sensation which swirled through his brain down to his chest, and let it loose. The black palm which had come into being cried out in joy and smoothly stretched itself out. It crept up to the rear of the earth dragon's back, where it threw down the pink-haired girl who had denounced him. Letting off a shriek, Ram wildly tumbled onto the sand. Confusion racked Ram's face, indicating she had no idea what had happened after she had been hit by the demonic hand which wasn't visible to the naked eye. Subaru rushed over next to where Ram was lying down atop of the sand. And then, "Subaru, don't you mess about with me." Saying that he didn't think at all about REM, saying things like that, was no joke. Consumed by anger, everything had become like whichever way he looked at it from, following his overheated thoughts. "Ram, irk." Subaru leaned down over the supine Ram and began to strangle her slender neck. Creak, creak. Creak, creak, creak. Chapter 15, Scattered to the Sand. Subaru's fingers wrapped around the slender, white neck. As Subaru tightened his hold using all of his strength and felt their neck bones creaking underneath his palms, he felt like something was quite out of place, like it was a girl's slender neck. Ram, uck. Ram was being straddled and her neck was being strangled by someone with all their might. A groan escaped from her lips. Her noble features were warped in agony, and drool could be seen dribbling down from the corner of her rosy lips. Her red tongue danced from side to side, searching for freedom inside of her mouth. She thrashed her arms and legs about, desperately resisting him. Ram. Subaru couldn't possibly put up a fight against Ram if she put up a serious resistance. She had managed to strike Garfield down for a bit back at the sanctuary by herself, and even if she hadn't, she was a woman that should be well acquainted with the art of self-defense. It would be reasonable to assume that she should possess multiple ways to restrain him and deal with a situation of this ilk where she was seized from above by a man like this. However, that would boil down to whether she could at least get one of her limbs free or not. Subaru, invisible providence. Ram, GH. Subaru set free the dark emotions within his chest as he strangled her neck with a creak creak. The dark, invisible sediment took shape and helped keep Ram's arms and legs firmly pinned down now. With her limbs pinned down, Ram was unable to struggle about effectively. Her breath would soon stop so long as he continued to put his strength into strangling her neck. Ram, too, would have regretted her reckless remarks from earlier if she stopped breathing. Subaru would be able to make her pay with her life for having wounded his heart with her misdirected callous remarks, and for her ungrounded thoughtless remarks which had been spurned by her selfishness, and for having spoken light of REM, for thinking he never cared for her. Subaru, it's you who's at fault. It's you. Ram was detestable. Ram was detestable. Ram was detestable. All of those little things that piled up poured out one after the other. He put his hatred into the fingers which were strangling her neck, his nails dug into her pale skin, and blood trickled down. Ram, hook. Ram turned her eyes full of hate at Subaru, who was breathing heavily and relishing the touch of hot blood at the end of his fingernails. What was with that inflexibility in her light pink irises that gazed at him while the light of her life was about to be snuffed out? It's as if they were complaining, saying, "I won't truly die by having my life taken." He decided that he would gouge out her eyes after he strangled her to death. Subaru, gonna rip you apart piece by piece, bitch you. When I think of you looking at me with that face which is a spitting image of Rem's, it makes me wanna hurl. Ram. Subaru? What is it? I can't hear you. If you got something to say, then say it clearly. Ram, law. Ram wheezed something out that overlapped with the last syllable of Subaru's abusive tirade. For a split second, Subaru narrowed his eyes to the echo of that sound. Then the sand beneath Subaru, who was pushing Ram down, exploded and both of their bodies were blown away. Subaru, WH, Ram, Gah. Subaru was showered in sand by the sudden blast which got inside of his mouth and eyes. He toppled down towards the back to the taste of sand and pain. Ram too had been caught up in the explosion, and her small body had taken the brunt of it as she tumbled away from him. Bearing cuts from the explosion, the blood Ram spilled had spattered across the sand. However, Ram had escaped from Subaru's clutch. That was the fact of the matter. Subaru, Ram. You used fucking magic. Ram, I had enough time to take a gasped breath. That's all I need, to be able to chant GH. Ram picked herself up from her knees, her breathing was in a feeble state. She had barely managed to chant out her Fulawind magic whilst her neck was being strangled. Unable to afford to miss and unable to aim accurately, she had instead aimed underneath her. As a result, she had dragged both herself and Subaru into the blast and escaped from danger. Subaru, TCH. Ram. As soon as he came to that realization, Subaru turned his hand to the back of his waist and pulled out his whip. At the same time, Ram pulled out a short wand from her bosom, letting her fighting spirit well out, showing that she was prepared for battle. Ram as a magician had the capacity to deliver one strong blow, but even Subaru wouldn't be bested when it came to the speed which he could attack at. The swift nature of the whip was one that was favored even by the big guns of this world. He should crack his whip straight at her unperturbed looking face, so to make it one that he'd never have to see again. Subaru, even if you start crying and apologizing, it's far too late. Ram, that's my line. There's no value in letting an uncaring sex freak like you Barusa meet Rem turn to pieces and wither upon the sand. Subaru, whatever you say. Subaru's resolve in dealing with Ram, who had softly let her murderous intentions flare up, stiffened as well. Making use of the light of the lantern which had dropped down between them, both Ram and Subaru continued to glare at each other, moving around each other in a circle as they slowly tried to get within striking distance. And just as the lid was about to be blown off on them, slaughtering each other just a few seconds before that happened. Alright, that's enough. Subaru and Ram, The sound of violent applause echoed throughout, and both Subaru and Ram's faces jerked up on hearing its withered timbre. The one who had interrupted them, Anastasia, was looking down on them from Dragonback. She glared at the two who had been on the verge of trying to kill each other in turn, still sat alone on top of Patrash. Anastasia, that's enough. I don't think it's acceptable that you're both glaring at each other with such angry looks on your faces despite us all being on the same side. There ought to be limits no matter where you are. Subaru, limits? Of course there's limits. And the one who stepped over them and said something that she never should have is that girl there, isn't it? That's why I'm making her pay for it. Anastasia, since I ain't getting through to you, what about you, Ram-san? Anastasia looked on in shock at Subaru as he jabbed his finger at Ram, and spoke with spittle flying out of his mouth. She had turned her flow of talk towards Ram, but the response she received from the pink-haired girl wasn't all that different from Subaru's. Ram still warily kept the tip of her wand pointed at Subaru, keeping herself on guard for battle. Ram, what a foolish question. It's Barusa's attitude that's intolerable. I'm rather at the limits of my patience. If all he cares about is himself, then why don't we go and drop him in the pitch-black darkness alone just like he wants? Subaru, I have no words for this bullshit, fuck off. Anastasia, no good from her too, huh? Geez, why? Seems like I've got too much on my shoulders. Seeing Ram's attitude, whose anger remained unrelenting, Subaru's anger also showed no signs of disappearing. Anastasia shrugged her shoulders with a gesture that indicated she'd given up on the two of them, who continued to exchange sharp looks of murderous intent. Looking at her from the corner of his eye, Subaru began to feel irritated at Anastasia as well. In the first place, why was Anastasia alone making a face that looked just like she was an outsider? He wondered who the hell it had been that was behind everything that had happened. He wondered who the hell it was that had first told him to travel to the Augria sand dunes and aim for the Sage's watchtower. Who the hell did they think they were leaving everything to others despite unmistakably having the strongest incentive for setting out to the watchtower? And on top of that, they were sitting alone, even now, looking down from the top of his Patrash. Subaru, Heu. What the hell are you preaching to me from up above? Get down. Anastasia, it's come to that. Subaru, get on the same level as me before you run your mouth with your arrogance. I'll hear what you have to say after that. I ain't gonna let you run your mouth at me unless you can do that. He swung his whip down, scattering sand up with a whoosh. His whip caused skin to split open if it hit its target. Even by looking at it, his whip was a weapon designed to inflict cruel wounds. It probably wouldn't matter if he hurt her host body regardless of whether Iridna was inside of it. As a matter of fact, Anastasia complied with Subaru's orders and slowly climbed down from Patrash's back. Right after she landed gingerly onto the sand, she cocked her head and asked, "Now what?" Anastasia, there, I got down too, but... Natsuki-kun, what is it that you want to do? Subaru, that should be obvious. I'll let that idiot take back what she said before, and if she doesn't want to, then there'll be just one thing left to do. If Ram changed her attitude and apologized from the depths of her heart, taking back everything she had said up until now, then Subaru would consider taking into account the extenuating circumstances. However, Ram's reaction, who'd heard what he'd said, was something that was easy enough to understand. Anastasia, well, that's what Natsuki-kun's saying, but what do you think of it, Ram-sam? Ram, that's out of the question. You're leaping to conclusions, for I have nothing that should be taken back. I'm having a hard time understanding what on earth I'd be saying differently. Ram snorted, declaring that with an attitude that looked like she was making a fool out of them from the depths of her heart. That was her answer. Thus, with that, she had forever lost her chance to be forgiven. Subaru, you heard her. Back off. I'm gonna make it so that there's only one face which is the same as Rem's in this world. Ram. Subaru, Hey? You got nothing to say? Ram, I'm talking to myself here, but idiocy is a contagious thing when speaking with idiots. That's why I am not say anything. A vein bulged across his forehead. Subaru's remaining patience got closer and closer to its limit. In that state, Subaru gathered his strength and tried to get to where Ram was straight ahead of him, so he could tear her limb from limb. Anastasia rushed out, spreading out her hands in front of Subaru. Anastasia, woho woho. Hey, calm down. You're jumping to conclusions again. Subaru, get out of my way. Do you want me to pummel the life out of you first? Anastasia, you left this to me. Remember? Hey, Ramsan, just a sec. Holding Subaru back, who was trying to step forward, Anastasia turned towards Ram. The taciturn Ram glared at Subaru, before reluctantly moving her gaze slightly towards Anastasia. However, it didn't seem likely that she would change her opinion. In fact, the look in her eyes betrayed that she had no intention to do so. It seemed like she had stepped towards Anastasia just out of obligation. Anastasia, look, Ramsan. I get that 'cause the air's bad and such, various feelings end up getting frayed, but… Ram, such talk doesn't matter right now, don't you think? More than that, go say it to that idiot. Anastasia, alright. It doesn't matter, geez. Giving off a fidgety impression, Ram tried to end her conversation with Anastasia as well. For the first time, she had moved her face away from Subaru and looked dead on at Anastasia. The reason was because she'd felt a sudden impact. The impact which had pierced into her body, more precisely, the left part of her chest was due to the thick knife which Anastasia held in her hand. Ram, gh. Anastasia, I had to eyeball a decision of which of you would be useful. Can you forgive me? She twisted her knife and pulled it out from the wound. Ram looked down at the fatal wound that had been birthed on the left side of her chest as blood tricked out from the corner of her lips. Then, she looked up at Anastasia, who had raised her hand up with a smile on her face, and collapsed in front of her. Ram feebly fell down onto the sand. The blood that gushed out of her continued to be soaked up by the parched sand. Subaru, ha? Subaru looked at the scene with his own eyes, at a loss at what had occurred. His palm which he held his whip with trembled, and his molars creaked in anger. Subaru, why did you? Anastasia, since you were going about it slowly Natsuki-kun, didn't it seem like you'd have ended up killing each other if Ramsan's vigilance couldn't be loosened? What would I do if both of you got injured, or both of you died? I can't escape from this place all alone, you know? Anastasia cocked her head at the angered Subaru, her face showing no ill will. Her words made logical sense, but what could he, who was crushed by logic, do about this fury of his? His urge that he should have attacked Ram was still uncontrollable, and his rage was still bottled up. Anastasia, or… Are you feeling like taking out your annoyance on me? Subaru. Anastasia, don't you think it's stupid to get seized up by your current rage and lose sight of the goal? I think that's enough of getting rid of companions for the time being. Anastasia's words continued to quench his fury as if she was slowly pouring water on them. It was certainly as she said, continuing to get rid of the thinking minds which had come this far was foolish. Moreover, Anastasia equals Eridna was their guide for their journey to the Pleiades watchtower. It was dubious whether her knowledge had come in use, but casting her aside would be regrettable. She was different from Ram. The latter's words only made him sick to the stomach and had no use to him. Anastasia was a piece that would be bothersome to lose, yes, that's how it was. Subaru, alright, I'll get on board with your persuasion for now. Anastasia, that's great with me. No, thank goodness. What a relief. Making a show of patting her chest in relief, Anastasia smiled from ear to ear. And then, she stepped through the sand, giving off a perilous impression, and came toward Subaru, proffering her hand out. Perhaps she wanted them to shake hands? Anastasia, a reconciliation, a handshake, to show that from here on out, we'll treat each other well, won't we? Subaru. Subaru faltered for a moment in thought as he looked at the hand she had offered out to him. Her face showed no traces of maliciousness. Anastasia's true feelings, or rather, right now it was Eridna's true feelings. He didn't truly know what she was scheming. He was neither comfortable or optimistic enough to think that everything she'd spoken was the truth. To start with, Anastasia had killed Ram with the knife that she'd kept concealed, whilst she expressed the same smile as she was showing now. Indeed, with a knife that she had kept concealed. The thick knife she was holding looked like it could cut all the way to the bone depending how it was handled. Since it had been put in their survival kit along with their lanterns, the kind of utility of an item that was presumed to be for survival was pretty high. However, she had kept it concealed all this time, and had used it in self-defense at her time of need. No, it may not have been self-defense. Anastasia, Natsuki-kun? Subaru. Anastasia, you ain't taking my hand? The hand she had offered out, her right one, was empty. However, her left hand was still holding the knife, even now. The range at which he'd be able to shake her hand was also the range at which the knife would be able to reach him. At least one of his hands would be occupied if he took her hand. He didn't even need to consider which out of his whip and her knife would be more effective at this distance. Taking her hand, wasn't that in itself a trap? Shouldn't he kill her before he was killed? Anastasia, Natsuki-kun? Subaru, don't worry, it's nothing. Subaru gave a weak smile and reached out for Anastasia's right hand. The moment in which she lowered her guard completely would be his chance, after they took each other's hand. Invisible providence. He once again invoked his unseen hand, and the black hand slowly fixed its sights onto Anastasia's slender neck. He wouldn't make the same mistake as he had with Ram. Next, he would make the black palm mercilessly crush her throat. He would teach a lesson to the woman who had kept belittling him ever since she had managed to secure the upper hand with her knife. Although, even if he wanted to show her, this palm wasn't visible. Subaru. Then, Subaru slowly took her outstretched hand with his own whilst he put the fingers of his black hand around Anastasia's neck. The touch of slender fingers, Anastasia's smiles grew deeper. And at the same time, Subaru's lips broke into a sad smile too. Anastasia, well then. Right here. Thus, he believed. He would use the strength of his demonic hand before Anastasia could finish speaking and raise her knife. He would grasp her slender neck with his black fingers and crush her neck bones in an instant. Just before that happened, however, a blade of wind came streaming in and cut Anastasia's body in two from behind. He felt like he'd hallucinated that a wind had blown straight after that. A spray of red gushed out right in front of his eyes, a daft voice let out an "eh," and Anastasia's body was cut in two across the middle. A heap load of blood was strewn out onto the white sand. Steaming shit and warm guts mingled in with the cold air, leaving behind a putrid smell to hang over the inside of the cave. Pink small and large intestines, along with many other internal organs that still showed faint traces of activity, rolled onto the sand. The sand itself had turned into a showcase of organs, in which the items on display were the raw ingredients that made up a young girl. Subaru, huh? Seeing the spectacle in front of him, Subaru cast his gaze down to his own hand. What he saw there was Anastasia's upper body swinging about. She was still firmly grasping Subaru's right hand with hers. She opened her eyes and speechlessly looked up at Subaru. Behind her, the lower part of her body, which had been cut at the waist, was flopping about. Her legs were convulsing like a marionette, and pee was pouring out everywhere as her muscles had relaxed. Subaru, ahhhhhhhhhhhh. Subaru let out a scream at Anastasia's horrific condition. He immediately tried to shake her arm away, however she was holding on with inordinate strength. Unable to shake her off, Subaru just swung the now half-in-weight Anastasia about. More blood spewed out of her as she was swung about, and the intestine that still connected the upper half of her body with her lower jolted about, scattering body fluids everywhere and emitting a foul odor. Subaru, let go. Let go. Anastasia, no. I don't want to die. Subaru, you're already dead. Can't you grasp that you're beyond saving? Her vivid laments were far more clear than imagined, leading Subaru to scream in return. The upper and lower half of her body had now separated and so much blood and guts had flooded out. It was wrong for her not to have died immediately. It was also wrong for her to still keep grasping his hand. It was also ridiculous. Subaru, let go. Anastasia, no. I won't, I absolutely won't, hook. Subaru, even if you say that now, I can't do ghaa. The upper half of Anastasia clung to his arm, and pain shot through Subaru's shoulder as he tried to throw her off. Anastasia was still holding the knife in her left hand, and had thrust it into Subaru's body in an attempt to hold on to him. The sharp blade easily pierced through Subaru's left shoulder, and cracked his collarbone beneath it. Bleeding and scorching pain caused Subaru to scream. Subaru, ghaa. Fucking idiot, hurry up and de. Anastasia, no, hook. Subaru fiercely grabbed Anastasia by the face and forcefully tore off her body. With great difficulty, he held the girl who had shouted something out whilst in tears, and threw her away. From the start, Anastasia's body had been quite petite. And now that she had become half, and with all the blood she had lost, she felt as light as a feather. Subaru, yeah. Without taking any notice of that, Subaru put his hand on his wounded right shoulder. His sight flickered in pain, and his heartbeat accelerated like it was going to explode. However, it wasn't a life-threatening wound. Subaru sluggishly reached into his thoughts whilst besieged by an unchanged sickening tension. The blow that had killed Anastasia before was Barusu. Subaru, gha. A shadow swayed up in front of Subaru, who had fallen onto his backside and was gasping in pain. A slender girl with blood covering half of her body came into view from the dim light of the lantern, which was half buried in sand. Ram. Since she had been stabbed in the chest by Anastasia's knife, he'd taken her for dead. Yet, the girl still breathed. And keeping a hold of her tenacity, she had killed Anastasia with her magic. Subaru, this fucking idiot. If you're gonna die, then fucking die on your own. Subaru declared that with annoyance in his voice as he looked up at the staggering Ram. It wasn't as if Ram wasn't covered in wounds. Anastasia's attack had been fatal for sure. The bleeding from the wound in her chest hadn't stopped, and even now, blood was endlessly soiling her skirt all the way down to its hem. It looked like she'd soon die due to blood loss. However, before that happened, she could take Subaru with her. Subaru, it. Subaru looked around his surroundings, trying to find his arme de guerre, his whip. However, even if he located it, his right arm which he used to wield it was injured from the shoulder. He couldn't wield it with his left arm like he did with his right. Then, he had just one choice left. Subaru, Invisible Providence. His trump card, which he'd already relied on many times in this short period of time. Once again, Subaru's brain throbbed in burning pain the moment he tried to unleash the strength of his invisible black palm. An agony like his skull was being bored through by a drill exploded within him. Subaru, GHA. Hug. Puke trickled out from the corner of Subaru's mouth due to the agony that visited him in waves. In exchange for trying to use his trump card past its limits, his consciousness was broken up by the hellish banquet that had woken up inside his skull, starting from his cranial nerves. The pain of his right shoulder and such wasn't even comparable to this. Whittling at his brain and skull, the sense of loss froze Subaru's will like it was gnawing at his soul. Speaking nothing of the resistance he offered with his crappy whip, Subaru, who was writhing in agony, was prime prey. The dying ram moved her body fueled only by hatred and slowly made her way towards Subaru, raising her bloodstained wand. Ram, foe. Subaru, Ga. Uwaya. Subaru rolled over to where Anastasia lay in her pool of blood, still holding his head. Looking down at him, Ram's lips stirred, and she began to chant her spell. And then. Ram, la. Subaru. She completed her chant, and the blade of wind which she created hewed Subaru down. But before that came to be, the sound of something hard being chewed echoed out across the cold cave of sand. That horrible grating sound continued, and it changed into the sound of flesh and water being chewed. Subaru, That he would die, that he would be hewn down, Subaru had been convinced of that. However, the death that should have come to him didn't come at all. Finally, Subaru, who had been breathing heavily and rolling around, had his headache and feeling of loss start to slowly subside. Subaru, He covered his face with his left hand and briskly shook his head, which was drenched in cold sweat. Though a dull ache remained, the sharp blade-like agony had faded. Taking deep breaths, he lifted himself up using the strength of his entire soul. Subaru wiped his moistened cheeks whilst he foolishly took the time to raise only his upper body. He noticed that his palm was covered in bright red, the source of which came from his own eyes. It seemed like he had shed tears of blood. A lot of blood dripped from his nose as well. The lower half of his face was probably in a horrific state. There was likely no doubt that the drilling pain which pierced directly to his brain was in recompense for his unseen hand. It was a familiar story. The feedback from having used his special superpower had come. Subaru, what hap? Briskly wiping his face with his sleeve, Subaru looked around his surroundings. He had no idea how much time he'd spent in agony. Nevertheless, he had hardly even thought it possible that he had it in himself to spend his time like that. Something had happened, and with it he had been. Subaru, Patrash? Patrash. Subaru's jet-black earth dragon nestled up beside him as he sat in blank amazement. Crouched down on the sand, she heard Subaru's call and shook her long tail, indicating that she was in good health. Subaru, so you were uninjured? Let me think. Just now, he recalled what had happened before. He recalled the scene in which Anastasia had been cut in two by Ram, and the latter aiming down at him. Subaru should have been ripped to shreds by Ram's doing. Subaru, and yet, why did Ram? Perhaps she had used up all her strength and collapsed. Though it was a really convenient development, Ram had been bearing fatal wounds. It wouldn't be far-fetched to think that she'd collapsed. Subaru, is that lucky or unlucky? He didn't want to say that he was lucky since she had been no less than almost dead. However, if he thought about it, he still couldn't say he was unlucky since he ought to have been dead if things had gone south. In any case, now wasn't the time to go on about these things. Given that everyone who had gotten in his way was gone, he had to get out of this place as soon as he could and make his way to the watchtower. Subaru, Patrash, sorry, let me hop on. Patrash. Subaru, Patrash? Subaru called out to her and touched her back, but the earth dragon didn't obey his instructions. On the contrary, Patrash, who had crouched down, still didn't make any move to show her face to him. She was sitting next to him on the sand, looking rather at peace, merely breathing heavily over and over. Subaru, hey, Patrash. Are you listening? Hey. His irritation slowly started to increase. It was a spiral of negative emotions which built up at supersonic speed, similar to those which he had felt against Ram and Anastasia. He felt like he wanted to teach the unresponsive Earth Dragon her place. Subaru, Patrash, you, look over here. Hey. Patrash. Subaru, bastard, listen to what I've been saying from the start. Patrash lifted her head up at Subaru, who had raised his voice and furiously slapped her back. He realized that she was trying to come face to face with him to try and express her words, breathing heavily out of her nose. Patrash's mouth looked far from normal and was dyed in red. Subaru. That crimson color was one that he had become used to seeing already in this short period of time. That color coated parts of Subaru's body as well, and still streamed down from his right shoulder even now. The foul smell which drifted around the area lay thick in it, along with that of piss and shit, there was no mistaking it. However, he hadn't wanted to notice something, he shouldn't have noticed it. Subaru. Pink hair innumerably entwined itself between the fangs that lined Patrash's mouth, who had now turned his way. Subaru, eep. On the other side of the crouched Patrash's large body, Ram, whom he had lost sight of, fell down to the ground. Though the body of the girl fell, he couldn't tell whether she was lying face up or face down. Checking that would be easy to tell if he looked at her head, but it was precisely because of that which he couldn't. He couldn't assess that because everything above her neck was chewed and its original shape was lost. Ram's skull had been crushed by vicious fangs and her brain juice had spilled out, leaving her dead. Just like Anastasia, who'd had her guts spilled out before dying, Ram had had the contents of her skull spilled out. And, the one who'd done that, Patrash, was staring intently at Subaru now. Her yellow eyes, which resembled that of a reptile, were sharply and cruelly tinged with madness. Subaru, STO. The last thing he saw was her maw opening up millimeters from his eyes. All that Natsuki Subaru heard was the sound of his own body being chewed up all the way until just before he slipped out of consciousness. Even after his head was crushed and his ears stopped working, the sound continued. He almost ended up laughing, wondering where he was hearing the sound from. However, he had no mouth to laugh with, no life that he could merely laugh at, and nothing which he could laugh at. He was chewed up by his companion, and died. End of chapters 14 through 15, Faith Built Upon the Sand.